Hi, everyone. We're back, and I want to shift our focus to look at church architecture again. So, if you think about it, last Christian structure we looked at was Hagia Sophia during the Byzantine era. And as mentioned already, the Christian church is really the foundation of European culture of the Middle Ages, and it undergoes a good bit of change in this time. And so I'm going to use as a case study one particular church built during what we want to call the Ottonian Empire. So, the early part of the Middle Ages characterized by a kind of loose association of different kingdoms and some movement and some kind of mixing of cultures and so forth. There were efforts in the 800s and 900s to kind of consolidate power, and I want to focus up on the Ottonian Empire, known for the rule of the three Ottos. So, what are we talking about? Essentially, what is today primarily Germany and Switzerland, and it will become after the last of the Ottos passes on, it will become the Holy Roman Empire. So, what I want to do is look at this case study, as I mentioned already. This church dedicated to a saint, not one of your A-list saints. His name, he was most likely a regional saint, Cyriacus. And the town in which this church was built was Gernrode. So here is the exterior of St. Cyriacus at Gernrode. And we're seeing for the first time, and I'm going to bring back right now, yes, Santa Sabina. So here's the exterior of Santa Sabina. So we're seeing for the first time the inclusion of towers on the outside of a church. And it was going to become at this point pretty standard to have pairs of towers, sometimes pairs of towers at the front of the church, and sometimes an additional tower in the middle of the church. But regardless of the disposition of towers, towers are going to become a thing. Why? Because during this Ottonian period, the Ottos, whichever one happened to be in charge at any given moment, saw as a really good way to cement their support with the church to sponsor, that is, hand over money or access to materials like stone to whatever entity was trying to build a church. So sometimes that entity is a monastery, and I think that's what we're looking at here. And we will talk more about monasteries next week, but I just want to point out that the whole connection between towers and the secular power of emperors had to do with towers being originally only built in association with the residence or the palace of an emperor. And a sign that the emperor was showing you favor or was literally bankrolling your church building was to add towers. So even though towers became a regular addition to church building, certainly the emergence of towers happened and coincided with the power of the Emperor Otto I, and then followed by Otto II, Otto III. So I want to take us inside, and we are above looking along the nave of this structure, just to kind of remind you of the major elements of a basilica church. So nave is the long, narrow passage that leads to the apse. And the other notable thing is that this church and churches at this point started getting taller and adding second stories, which you can see in both of these views from the nave. This would be to accommodate more visitors, more believers in the church. So the question is, in the case specifically of this church, why did you need so many why did you need so much space for believers, like extra visitors? And it has to do with this question. So I want you to look down the nave and note that the actual altar, and remember the altar is a stone table at which the priest stands. The altar in this case is reached by a series of steps. And what that means is, in fact, there was a fairly sizable space underneath the altar, underneath that apse, accessible by the little door that is just left of the red arrow. So the question is, what was doing underneath the apse? And here's the answer: a crypt. The fact is that in any church built in the early years of Christianity, starting in Rome and then moving out from Rome, and certainly stretching into the Middle Ages, generally speaking, there was a crypt that held the remains of, in this case, Saint Cyriacus. So one of the reasons that churches often at this era had saints' names is the actual saints' remains were buried or sometimes placed in an above ground tomb in the crypt. So why is this important? Well, I'm going to go back here for a minute. This is important because Saint Cyriacus happened to be a saint who, at least again, regionally, locally, I'm not saying pulling in visitors from way far away, but Saint Cyriacus, the legend attached to the saint, would have had something to do with a miracle. And through sharing stories from one village to another, people would hear about, oh, so-and-so's sick child was healed when so-and-so went to visit the remains of Saint Cyriacus. So it's quite possible that during this period, the Ottonian period, with the help of monetary donations by the emperor, this church expanded because there was a sudden kind of increase in popularity to get near the tomb of Saint Cyriacus. And the people who wanted to get near Saint Cyriacus in his entombed state would have been people who might have had illness, might have been somebody who did a really bad thing. And their local priest is like, dang, you've got to go be near the tomb of a very sacred, very holy person. That might help you. And so we're beginning to see a couple of things. The east end, and it's always the east, typically, the east end of the church is where the apse is. The east end of the church, therefore, is where the altar is. And lo and behold, it is at the east end of a church that, beginning around the 900s and certainly expanding into the material we'll be talking about next week, the east end becomes a focus for remains, or what we'll call relics, of holy people, because the crypt was always located underneath where the altar stood at the east end. So we're going to see a lot of focus on developing, enlarging. In this case, we elevated the floor of the apse so that there would be plenty of space underneath the floor in the crypt for extra visitors to go down there, touch the tomb of Saint Cyriacus, say a couple of prayers, leave some kind of token of thanks, and get out again to let the next set of visitors come in. And so what we're going to see in the churches that we talk about next week is that sort of influx of visitors will require east ends of churches to get bigger and more elaborate, even as, the altar's still there, the priest is still standing there. So again, we call these visitors pilgrims, and we call these trips that pilgrims make pilgrimage. And we've already touched on pilgrimage in the context of Islam. But what I want to kind of sort of plant in your minds as we look at churches next week. Churches were not merely the place you went if you lived nearby and, oh, it's Sunday, I got to go to church. Church became a site for pilgrims who might have traveled hundreds of miles on foot to get to the crypt of a given church, given that, again, the relics of a holy person were believed to either be able to absolve you of your sins or maybe even bring about some outcome that you specifically want. Okay, from this same period, I want to talk a little bit still at the east end, not of St. Cyriacus, but just in general, thinking of altars. So way back in the Byzantine era, we saw mosaic as a way of decorating the space in an apse around and above an altar. Sculpture, too, was a way of bringing attention and focus to the altar. And I am showing you an Ottonian cross, sculptured actual crucifix, and this would have originally, it's in a museum now, would have originally hung above the altar. And so when we see an image like this, we note immediately that this Christ on this crucifix is decidedly human. And why do I say that? Well, so yeah, we see a halo, and it's actually a nimbus because it is a halo that includes also a cross. And this nimbus is actually, has embedded in it jewels. And the INRI inscribed above is from the New Testament, and essentially are the letters that represent the phrase, "Here is the King of the Jews," the kind of charge leveled against Christ for claiming to be so. But why am I saying this is a kind of human Christ? It's the fact is, we are very conscious when we look at this sculpture that this was a mortal human being, that this was someone who walked the earth, teached, listen to me, I'm a teacher, taught, had a ministry, performed miracles, but at the end of the day was a human being who ultimately was persecuted and killed. And this sculptor, we don't know who it is, made a point of showing the kind of strain in the connective tissue from the shoulder to the chest, that this lifeless body is hanging on this cross. Obviously, the head, too, hangs heavily. The belly is distended. There is this sense that we are not looking at the aspect of Christ that is, the Son of God, this miraculous supernatural being, but rather, no, we're looking at a human suffering. And so, again, to go back a few weeks thinking about, well, how do you picture Jesus? Because he lives in both worlds. He's the Son of God. He is a man. And here we see, kind of going all the way back to those early images of Christ as Good Shepherd and the catacombs, we see a sense of, a broken body on that cross. Okay, folks, that's it. Talk to you soon. Bye.